It was the early hours of New Year's Day, 1998. 21-year-old Ben Smart and 17-year-old Olivia Hope had spent the night celebrating, welcoming the arrival of a brand new year. As the first morning began to break and the energy of the party finally started to fade, the pair were left searching for somewhere to sleep in the Marlborough Sounds, a striking stretch of sea-drowned valleys scattered across New Zealand's South Island. The last time anyone would see them alive was as they stepped out of a water taxi and onto a yacht. They were guided there after accepting an offer from a man they had just met. He had told them they could rest on his boat. Perhaps they knew that trusting a stranger in the middle of the night was risky, but with no beds left in the accommodation they had originally reserved, it might have felt like they had no choice. From that moment on, Ben Smart and Olivia Hope vanished. Neither of them would ever be seen again. Their bodies were never found. Their belongings were never recovered. What followed was a long 5-month investigation that focused on the man police believed had been that stranger. He never wavered in claiming he was innocent. Yet despite the lack of physical evidence, the case against him relied heavily on circumstantial details and the testimony of jailhouse informants. Statements like these are often controversial and unreliable, and in a case that captured national attention, they became the foundation of what would be described as one of New Zealand's most debated prosecutions. So, will we ever truly know what happened in those dark early hours of the morning? The answer is almost certainly no. Ben and Olivia were best friends, though at one point in the past they had been much more. The young couple had once dated, but in time their relationship had shifted back into friendship. And so, as New Year's Eve 1997 approached, they decided to welcome the year ahead together at Furneaux Lodge, a popular destination in the Marlborough Sounds, set in Endeavour Inlet. The lodge could only be reached by boat, but the pair had already arranged to sleep on a nearby yacht moored close by. At 21, Ben was still deciding on the direction of his future. For the moment, he was working for his father. Olivia, just 17, had only recently finished high school. She had already secured a scholarship to attend Otago University. The year ahead held promise, opportunity, and excitement. The celebration that night was no small gathering. It was a massive New Year's Eve party with more than 1,500 people in attendance. Music, alcohol, and laughter carried on well past midnight. Spirits were high, and the festivities rolled into the early hours of the morning. By around 4 a.m., Ben and Olivia decided it was finally time to sleep. Their bunks were meant to be on the chartered yacht Tamarack, but because they arrived so late, their spaces had already been taken by other guests. Left stranded once again, they hailed a water taxi that was ferrying partygoers between the lodge and the moored boats scattered across the bay. At the helm was Guy Wallace, a bartender from the lodge, helping passengers get back safely. Along with Ben and Olivia, 3 others were on board, 2 women and a man who appeared to be alone. During the short ride, that man began speaking with the young pair. He offered them a place to crash on his yacht. They agreed. After all, they had few other options. And perhaps, because they were together, they felt there was some level of safety. According to Wallace, he dropped the 3 of them off at the yacht the man identified as his. That was the final time anyone saw Ben Smart and Olivia Hope alive. The next morning, when neither Ben nor Olivia could be reached, their families grew worried. They began asking friends who had been at the party if anyone knew where the pair had gone. In those first hours, everyone still hoped that Ben and Olivia were simply asleep somewhere, recovering from the night before. But as the hours passed, that hope quickly turned into fear. By January 2nd, there was still no trace of Ben or Olivia. It was then that their parents officially reported them missing to police. This behavior was completely out of character. They were not the type to vanish without telling friends or family where they were. Authorities immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Very quickly, what began as a missing persons inquiry escalated into a potential homicide case. Investigators gave it the code name Operation Tam, taken from the name of the yacht, Tamarack, where Ben and Olivia had originally booked bunks. Search efforts were launched across the waterways, looking for bodies or even just discarded belongings. Given the amount of alcohol consumed at the party, one of the first working theories was that perhaps one of them had fallen into the water by accident and the other had tried to rescue them. But despite extensive searching, nothing was found. With over 1,500 people attending the New Year's Eve party, the sheer number of statements to collect was staggering. At the same time, investigators believed that among so many witnesses, at least someone must have noticed something useful. One of the earliest and most significant witnesses was Guy Wallace, the bartender who had been driving the water taxi. Police quickly realized he was very likely among the last people to see Ben and Olivia alive. Through him, they identified the two women who had also been passengers on the water taxi. Those women were cleared almost immediately. But the focus then shifted to the lone male passenger, the man Wallace said had offered Ben and Olivia a place to stay on his yacht. Guy described the vessel as a wooden, two-masted sailboat, around 38 to 40 feet in length, with a blue stripe painted along the hull. One of the female passengers confirmed that description. As for the man himself, he was said to be scruffy, with about 2 days' worth of stubble. Roughly 5'9", with short, dark, wavy hair, and possibly tattoos on his arm. He wore a Levi's shirt with jeans and had been spotted earlier that evening at the lodge's lounge bar. According to Wallace, during the taxi ride, this stranger had been openly watching Olivia and behaving in a sleazy manner before suggesting the pair could stay on his yacht. Investigators soon centered their attention on one individual, a local man named Scott Watson. He happened to have a criminal record, consisting mainly of petty offenses, theft, possession of cannabis, and an assault that had resulted in a prison sentence during his teenage years. But since that time, Scott had maintained that he had turned his life around. He had been out of prison for 8 years and had seemingly avoided further trouble, working and living quietly. But did he actually fit the description given by Wallace and the female passenger? In truth, he did not. So why did police target him so quickly? Some suspected it had to do with long-standing friction between Scott and local law enforcement. At the time of the party, Scott owned a yacht called Blade, moored in the Marlborough Sounds. However, Blade was a single-masted vessel, not a two-masted sailboat like the one witnesses described. It also lacked the distinctive blue stripe mentioned by both Wallace and the female passenger. Multiple witnesses claimed to have seen a two-masted yacht anchored in the bay that night, yet investigators appeared unwilling to accept that such a boat had even been present. Years later, a retired police officer revealed that officers had been directly instructed to disregard any reports of a two-masted yacht. There was another issue. Scott Watson was generally considered clean-cut in appearance, while the mystery man had been described as unkempt and scruffy. Composite sketches based on witness accounts looked nothing like Scott. Even his height, shorter than 5'9", did not match. Despite these discrepancies, investigators pressed on, convinced that Watson was their man. Guy Wallace was shown Scott's photograph at least 3 times. Each time, he said that Scott was not the stranger he had met on the water taxi. Wallace maintained that the man he had seen that night was someone entirely different, someone he and the lodge's bar manager, Roz McNeely, had both served drinks to earlier at the party. What police did next raised serious questions. They prepared a new photo lineup of 8 images, but this time, the picture of Scott Watson they included caught him mid-blink. The result gave him the appearance of having hooded or drooping eyes, a feature repeatedly mentioned in witness descriptions of the mystery man. This manipulated picture would later become infamous, remembered as the blink photo. When Wallace and McNeely were shown the lineup, both indicated that the photo of Watson could possibly resemble the man they had seen, mainly because of the eyes. Yet they added an important detail: the hair was wrong. The man on the taxi had longer, wavier, untidy hair. The photo of Watson showed him with short, neatly kept hair. Nevertheless, police appeared to stop listening after that tentative identification. A warrant was obtained to search Scott's boat and his family home. To those who knew him, it felt as though investigators were forcing a narrative that did not fit. Surveillance on Watson and his family intensified. officers were accused of monitoring them without proper cause, including wiretapping the Watson family phone. They even pressured Scott's girlfriend to try to elicit information. Over 70 hours of phone conversations were recorded, yet none contained anything incriminating. Meanwhile, damaging rumors began to spread through the community, alleging disturbing behavior between Scott and a family member. These rumors were completely unfounded and have since been dismissed as false, but at the time they added to the shadow cast over him. Then, in June of 1998, 5 months after Ben and Olivia vanished, Scott Watson was arrested and charged with their murders. This was despite the fact that no bodies had been discovered, no possessions had surfaced, and no direct evidence linked him to the disappearance. Their deaths were presumed, but with no remains and no proof, questions loomed large over the strength of the case. Scott Watson's trial began a year later. It lasted for 11 weeks and saw more than 500 witnesses called to testify. The prosecution presented a story in which Scott had been fixated on 17-year-old Olivia Hope. They argued that he lured both her and Ben Smart onto his yacht, Blade, before killing them and disposing of their bodies. But there was a glaring issue. Blade did not resemble the yacht described by witnesses on the night Ben and Olivia disappeared. Still, this was the version of events the jury was told. The defense called another water taxi driver as a witness. He testified that he had dropped Scott off at Blade between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. This contradicted the timeline, as Ben, Olivia, and the mystery man had been dropped at a yacht by Guy Wallace's taxi around 4 a.m. Passengers and neighbors of Blade supported this timeline, saying they were woken by Scott returning to his boat earlier that morning, loud, drunk, and intent on continuing the party. Even the prosecution accepted this fact. Scott said he eventually went to sleep after returning to Blade. The prosecution disagreed, alleging instead that he somehow went back to shore and boarded Guy Wallace's water taxi, where he encountered Ben and Olivia. But they had no proof of this. No witnesses, no taxi drivers, and no evidence placing him there. Still, they argued it did not matter how he returned to shore, only that he had. One of the most contested pieces of evidence was the blink photo lineup. Guy Wallace had been shown several photographs, including one of Scott mid-blink, giving him drooping eyes similar to those described by witnesses. At trial, prosecutors claimed Wallace had positively identified Scott as the mystery man. But after the trial, Wallace publicly stated he had been misled and was certain Scott was not the man on his taxi that night. He explained that although the photo captured a similarity in the eyes, Scott's other features, his hair, height, and build, were entirely different. Prosecutors maintained that Wallace was not the only person to identify Scott from that photo lineup. Another lodge employee also picked him out. But after the trial, she too recanted, signing an affidavit that she had been misled and had made a mistake. The prosecution also presented forensic evidence. Among the items seized from Blade was a blanket containing roughly 400 short, dark hairs. Olivia's hair was long and blonde, yet during later testing, 2 blonde strands were suddenly reported to have been found. They were said to match Olivia. The defense raised serious concerns over this. The chain of custody was flawed, the storage methods were inadequate, and cross-contamination seemed highly possible. Samples of Olivia's hair had not been kept separate from the blanket hairs. In fact, the bag containing her sample had a 1-centimeter hole in it, meaning hairs could have escaped and mixed with other evidence. Aside from these disputed strands of hair, nothing linking Ben or Olivia was found on Scott's yacht. No belongings, no blood, no fingerprints. The prosecution then shifted focus to scratch marks found on foam inside a hatch on Blade. They suggested these were made by Olivia as she tried to claw her way out. The defense countered, pointing out that the marks were located on parts of the foam only accessible when the hatch was open, not closed. Scott himself explained they were made by his nieces, who had played on the boat. Another central part of the prosecution's case came from 2 jailhouse informants. Both testified that Scott had confessed to murdering Ben and Olivia while in prison. Jailhouse testimony has long been considered unreliable, as inmates often have incentives to fabricate stories in exchange for leniency or privileges. Indeed, after the trial, both men recanted. One admitted he had lied because his safety in prison was threatened, and he hoped to secure early release. The second acknowledged that he barely knew Scott at all, despite claiming they were close. He revealed he had been given a car and a phone upon release in exchange for his testimony. There were also 3 additional witnesses, unrelated to the night in question, who claimed Scott had a history of anger and misogyny. They alleged that in the past he had made disturbing remarks about wanting to kill. One even recounted an incident from the year before, saying Scott had once said he should have killed a woman who had annoyed him at a hotel. The prosecution argued that these accounts portrayed him as a man capable of such crimes. Despite the inconsistencies, the questionable photo identification, and the lack of physical evidence, in September 1999, the jury found Scott Watson guilty of the murders of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years before parole eligibility. As the verdict was read, Scott protested, shouting, "You're wrong." He has maintained his innocence ever since. Following the conviction, Scott's legal team attempted multiple appeals. In 2000, his case went before the Court of Appeal, but without new evidence, a retrial was denied. In 2003, they petitioned the Privy Council, but again, no grounds for appeal were found. In 2009, Scott requested a royal pardon from the Governor-General of New Zealand, but this too was denied. By 2010, criticism of the Blink photo intensified. The Independent Police Conduct Authority released a report describing the use of the image as highly undesirable, particularly given the importance of suspect identification in this case. The report noted poor record-keeping and irregular procedures in how the photo montage was created, exposing the investigation to justifiable criticism and suspicion about intent. In 2015, having served the minimum 17 years, Scott became eligible for parole. A prison officer described 2 sides to his personality, one friendly and helpful, the other manipulative, withdrawn, and resistant. Based on these reports, the parole board deemed him a high risk for violent reoffending and denied release. He has since applied for parole 4 more times. Each request has been denied. In 2016, Olivia's father, Gerald Hope, publicly voiced his dissatisfaction with the way the disappearance and subsequent investigation had been handled. That same year, he agreed to meet with Scott Watson face-to-face. Gerald had long believed that the full truth of what happened on New Year's Day 1998 had never been uncovered. Yet after those meetings, he remarked that Scott's responses seemed rehearsed and insincere. The following year, in 2017, a second application for a royal pardon was submitted, this time challenging the validity of the 2 blonde hairs allegedly recovered from the blanket on Blade. Once again, the application was denied. In June 2020, Scott's case returned to the Court of Appeal for a second time, with the same argument regarding the reliability of the hair testing. He did not seek a retrial, acknowledging that without new evidence, there was little point. Tragically, a key figure in the case was no longer alive by then. Guy Wallace, the water taxi driver who had last seen Ben and Olivia board the stranger's yacht, died by suicide in March 2021 at the age of 55. At the time, he was facing charges of indecent assault involving a teenage girl. In his note, he denied the allegations and expressed once again his belief that Scott Watson was innocent. He also described the immense pressure he had faced from investigators to identify Watson as the mystery man, suggesting that police had implied that if he did not, he himself might become the prime suspect, since he too was one of the last to see the pair alive. As of now, Scott Watson has spent more than half of his life in prison. At 52 years old, his final appeal has concluded. The question remains whether he will die behind bars or one day be released. His mother, Beverly, passed away from cancer, but his father, Chris, has stood firmly by him. He once said, "I know he didn't do it, not from anything he's told me, but because I've studied the case and used my intelligence and common sense." Much of the discussion around this case has focused on Scott Watson and the possibility of a wrongful conviction, but it is vital to remember that 2 young lives, Ben Smart and Olivia Hope, were lost. Their families remain without closure. Their bodies have never been found. Ben's father, John Smart, died in 2009 after a short battle with melanoma. Olivia's parents continue to believe that crucial parts of the investigation were mishandled. Her father, Gerald, has questioned whether the police became fixated on a single suspect too quickly, overlooking other important leads. He pointed out that, at the time of Scott's arrest, hundreds of witnesses from the New Year's Eve party still had not been interviewed. Reports of a two-masted yacht with a blue stripe, consistent with descriptions given on the night, were repeatedly dismissed. If those accounts had been properly investigated, perhaps the case might have been solved, or at least Ben and Olivia's bodies located. Olivia's mother has taken a different view. She has remained convinced of Scott Watson's guilt. In one interview, she said, "I think he is innately evil. I don't think he should be let out." In 2016, a confidential report by the Maritime Research Group was leaked to the New Zealand Herald. It claimed to have solved the mystery, pointing to a grainy photograph taken 5 days after Ben and Olivia were believed to have been killed. The image appeared to show Olivia alive. The report also identified a two-masted yacht and 3 men connected to it, all with serious criminal histories involving drug trafficking. Witnesses had originally reported seeing this same yacht and possibly Olivia after the disappearance. But once again, police did not pursue those leads. The truth about what happened to Ben Smart and Olivia Hope remains elusive. It is almost certain they are no longer alive. But who was responsible and how events unfolded that night may never be fully known. What is clear is that the investigation has been criticized for tunnel vision, focusing so narrowly on one suspect that other possibilities may have been disregarded. Both lead detectives, Rob Pope and John Ray, have rejected these claims, standing by their work. Pope has described the trial as fair and transparent, while Ray has said he has no doubt that Scott Watson is guilty and even believes Watson knows where the bodies are. More than 2 decades later, the case still divides opinion. Was Scott Watson wrongfully convicted, or is he truly the man behind the disappearance of Ben and Olivia? Whatever the answer, the jury found him guilty. And for that reason, Scott Watson continues to serve a life sentence for the murders of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. And that brings us to the end of today's case. Thank you for joining me as we revisited the disappearance of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.